Levant, it's actually the exact opposite. Most of the power in the Middle East is shared between Turkey and Iran. Those are the two major power centers of the Middle East. And the Levant is only important because of the holiness of Jerusalem. And right now, because there is a non-Muslim religious minority that controls the territory. It has none of this has anything to do with economics. All right. After World War II, after World War One, as the British were deciding how they were going to divide up the territory, the Arabs outside of Palestine were generally in favor of, or at least the elites among the Arabs were generally in favor of the Zionist project, even with its more politicized character. You can see Weizmann and Faisal I. Faisal I was a Hashemite, meaning that he was one of a person from the Prophet's family, and he is related to the current monarchs of Jordan, who are also Hashemites. You can see Weizmann, he's even dressed in a kifaya, right, the Arab garb. Weizmann is on the left-hand side of the picture. Faisal I is on the right-hand side of the picture. The French appoint Faisal I to be the king of Syria. In 1920, there's an uprising in Syria, and he's forced to flee the area, and he becomes the first British king of Iraq. And his dynasty would survive in Iraq until 1958. But at this point, Faisal I expressed warm appreciation for the Zionist mission, and in his view, the revival of Jewish culture should result in a revival of Muslim culture, Muslim Arab culture, and the two would grow off of each other. Now, after the creation of these territories, the first thing that happened before the San Remo Conference was that it was divided into occupation zones. So you can see that you have, on the right-hand side map, you can see that there are 4 different regions. There's the South territory, there's the Northwest, there's the eastern part, and the northern part of the occupied territories. Now, the northern part is taken by Turkey in its independence war, which takes place between 1920 and 1923. The northwest part is, of course, parceled between Syria and Lebanon. And the southern part and some of the northwestern part would become part of Israel. So now the borders were not terribly clear between what would be French-occupied Lebanon and Syria, and what would be British-occupied Palestine and Jordan. And so you had the area of Tel Hai, which is just north of Kfar Giladi. As you can see on the map, it was in what would be eventually British Palestine, but it's not that far from the border of Lebanon, and it's part of the territory that goes up into Lebanon and is surrounded on Lebanon by 3 sides. So it was relatively ambiguous whether or not this would be part of Lebanon, and so there was a Zionist settlement at Tel Hai. The Zionist settlement included Joseph Trumpeldor, right, that a hero we mentioned from the Zionist Mule Corps, and the Lebanese Shiites who were living in the region believed that this was a French occupation force rather than a Zionist settlement, and so they attacked the settlement. The people of Tel Hai defended themselves, and 8 were killed. This included Joseph Trumpeldor, and you can see the monument in the center of a lion looking up. That is the monument to the 8 dead in Tel Hai. This is probably the first Arab-caused Zionist death in the history of what would become Israel. We also have below about a month after the San Remo Conference, we have what are called the Nebi Musa riots, where Arabs marched on Jerusalem, demanding that the mandates not be created or not enforced, and that Arabs be given independence. In these riots, 4 Arabs died and 5 Jews also died. There was also a lot of looting, especially of Jewish-owned properties, be they old Yishuv or new Yishuv. During the period of the Mandate of Palestine, the first thing the British did was that they cut off the Transjordan area of the Mandate of Palestine. You can see on the map here that the Transjordanian area was set apart in 1922. Despite the significantly larger region, Transjordanian Palestine was significantly smaller in population. The estimate is that at this period in time, the population in Jewish Palestine had risen to probably around 650,000. The population of Transjordanian Palestine was about 200,000. So 1/3 the size in terms of population, significantly more area, but the majority of this area is desert. You will also have the establishment of the colonial government of Palestine. And we have first Viscount Herbert Samuel, who was a British Jew and Zionist affiliated. He was seen as being relatively partial in the Jews' favor, but at the same time, he wanted to do what the British had done in other regions and appoint what was called a Grand Mufti, a representative of the Muslim community who could speak on behalf of Muslim affairs. And so, unfortunately for him, he wouldn't have chosen it, I don't think, but unfortunately for him, he had to choose between the leading members of the Muslim community that existed, and the one that was put before him was Hajj Muhammad Amin al-Husseini, who was a rather anti-Semitic individual, certainly a strong anti-Zionist, and eventually a collaborator in opposition to the British ruling authority.
Richard, why did they set up Transjordan? Like, what was the strategic goal of that?
Sure, there were several. The first major one was to implant positive British favor with the Arab elite. And so by carving off Transjordan and creating a Hashemite monarchy in Jordan, right, it was entrusted to Abdullah I, who was the great grandfather, I believe, of the current Abdullah II, who's the king of Jordan. And so by giving the Hashemites this control of a territory, the British made sure that they would have Arab support and continued access to Arab oil. The second major reason was that they wanted to constrain the Jewish settlement to the coastal region. They didn't want Jews moving further inland. And I think the final reason is that a lot of the desert areas were areas that the British wanted to maintain stronger border positions with, especially as the situation in Saudi Arabia was changing. It wasn't Saudi Arabia at that time. It was the Kingdom of Hijaz and the Kingdom of Najd, which were engaged in the beginnings of a war. The Saudi unification war occurred in the mid-1920s, and the British wanted to be on the vanguard of protecting their territories from that, and didn't think they could do it if Jewish settlement was going to be at that border. It would be too precarious.
Richard, I just wanted to emphasize how significant this was, because the part of Transjordan, part of the other side of the Jordan, had been part of the original biblical Hebrew territory, and the right-wing Zionist movement, the so-called revisionists, which at that time was a rather small minority, they based part of their ideology on the idea of a Jewish state on both sides of the Jordan. It's part of their anthem that both sides of the Jordan are Israel. So strategically, this, as you said, it did limit kind of the practical aspirations of the Zionist movement to just the Western side of what had been the Palestine Mandate.
During the period between 1920 and 1936, those 16 years, we also see the development of militias in the territory. Starting with the Battle of Tel Hai, a lot of Jews were under the impression, I believe correctly, that they needed a way to defend themselves on a local basis because they couldn't trust that British police would actively protect their interests. So in 1925, a number of veterans of the Zionist Mule Corps and other veterans of World War I came together to form the Haganah. And the Haganah became known as the Jewish Defense Forces. There was a split, though, within the Haganah by about 1931. And the difference between this group of the Haganah and the other groups was that this group in particular wanted to take the battle to the British. This group was called Etzel, Irgun Tzva Leumi, the organization of the National Army, but is often known just by that first word Irgun. And you can see their image in the center. As Ralph pointed out, the Irgun was motivated by a revisionist Zionist perspective, and you can see on their emblem Israel with the Jordan River in its center and continuing into Transjordan. So at the same time, within the Palmach, within the Haganah, there was the creation of a specialist militia, the higher tier of the Haganah, called the Palmach. You can see their emblem on the upper right-hand side of a sheaf being cut by two swords. The Haganah began to engage in numerous reconnaissance missions and defense missions of Jewish outposts. The Palmach was more technically skilled and would be involved in radio communications, in and out, wet work operations, these kinds of differences. The Palmach and the Haganah reported to each other and kept very close contact on what the other was doing because they saw each other as a unified defense force. In 1941, the Irgun split itself into two camps, the majority staying in the Irgun, and some leaving to join what was called Lechi, also called the Stern Gang. The Lechi was a movement where they disagreed with the Irgun not on tactics, but on allies. So the Irgun decided during World War II that they would fight alongside the British outside of Palestine, and within the borders of the Mandatory Palestine, they would fight against the British and British interests. The Lechi believed that they should actually put their weight with the Nazis and other anti-British groups, and actually try to form some kind of relationship with the Nazi Germans and perhaps secure a Jewish state that way. Understandably, the Lechi had a far smaller membership, and after they assassinated Count Bernadotte in 1949, the Israeli states eradicated them as an organization.
Could I point out that the Palmach was actually originally created by the British as a special commando force?
Okay.
That did some operations against Vichy-occupied Syria, because the British were not technically at war with Syria, with the Vichy French. They used the Palmach to establish certain missions, and on one of these missions, a Palmach officer by the name of Moshe Dayan lost his eye, in a battle when his eye was shut out. And after a couple of years, the Palmach was dissolved by the British, but the Jewish community, the Zionist community, took them on, retained them as a specialized commando force or strike force. So they became an integral part of the Jewish defense strategy or infrastructure.
Yeah, that's right. On the Arab side, you had the Lajna al-Arabiya al-Ulya, which was the higher Arab committee, and the higher Arab committee had a loose set of militias. They were nowhere near as organized as they were on the Jewish side, and the leadership would eventually dissolve and create the Jaysh al-Jihad al-Muqaddas, the Holy Jihad Army, and those who opposed them, primarily Arabs from outside of Palestine who wanted to have a larger stake in the affairs going on in Palestine, they created the Jaysh al-Inqadh al-Arabi, I'm trying to figure out how to translate this, the army for the Arabic revival. And that was led primarily by the Syrian Fawzi al-Qawuqji. So these, on the Arab side, you sort of had this pastiche of just local people with guns who sort of stood together And on the Jewish side, you had active drilling, organizational structures, training, um, and they were a much more cohesive fighting force. During this same time, during 1920 to 1936, the Zionists made sure to reach out to these minorities. Right, we see the Circassians on the left-hand side, and they were the first, as I said, to have strong and meaningful relations with the Zionists, especially in the Circassian city of Rakhanya. You can see on the lower side, Bedouin from the north, from the Galilee region. There are numerous cases that we have of Zionist outreach to the Bedouins, including Bedouins who learned Yiddish because of their repeated interactions. Bedouins and Circassians were part of the Israeli fighting force towards the end of the 1940s and into the Independence War. In fact, probably one of Israel's more famous generals during that war, Amos Yarkoni, was himself Bedouin. And Amos Yarkoni was his nom de guerre instead of Abdel Majid al-Hidra, which was his Arab birth name. And the Druze were more on the Jewish side after the Independence War, but they did have a number of fights during the mandatory period where they coordinated with the Haganah against Arab militias.
Richard, I have a question about the Balfour Declaration.
Sure.
Was the Balfour Declaration, did it intend for Palestine to remain under British mandate permanently, or did it accept that it was going to be a temporary setup?
Well,
in favor of a Jewish state?
The entire organization of a mandate was predicated on the idea the mandates would eventually become independent. The mandates were split into three classes. You had Class A mandates, Class B mandates, and Class C mandates. If a mandate was classified as Class A, it was believed that the local inhabitants had the propensity for self-government and would need to be institutionalized for a small amount of time, perhaps 20 to 40 years, before they would have the tools necessary for self-government. On the far end, on the other side, were Class C mandates, like, for example, some of the Pacific Islands were Class C mandates after they were taken from the Germans, like Papua New Guinea. And Class C meant that it was unforeseeable that any current class of people would be able to govern themselves, and so the mandate may have to exist for 100 years before these people are capable in any serious way of self-governance. So the idea was always that the indigenous population would be self-governing. The question, of course, was how to, and it was debated at the time, it's still debated now, what the meaning of a Jewish national homeland was. The Zionist interpretation has consistently been, regardless of whether these are left-wing Zionists or right-wing Zionists, the Zionist interpretation has consistently been that this term refers to a government of Jews governing Jewish affairs, and creating a Jewish national culture of which minorities can participate, but that should be at the direction of the Jewish people, in much the same way that French culture is at the direction of ethnic French, or in the same way that German culture is at the direction of ethnic Germans. The Arab perspective on what this Jewish national homeland meant was that Jews would have the ability to live and freely practice their religion in the region, but and to freely immigrate, but that they would not have cultural, social, or political control. That in, for want of a better term, it would be the same way that the United States takes in Jews and Jewish population almost without question at this point, right? Jews can immigrate freely to the United States under most metrics, but Jews do not have control of the culture, society, and military of the United States. That was the Arab understanding of this Jewish national homeland. And so if it was an Arab majority state that was created upon the independence of Palestine, that would have been their interpretation of Jewish national homeland going forward. Most Jews, I believe correctly, would have been very skeptical of the Arab willingness to entertain this kind of open arms philosophy, because of the penchant that Arab Muslims have had over history to enforce discriminatory laws and systems toward religious minorities.
I hope you don't mind. I keep on interrupting.
No, that's the point.
The Balfour Declaration was declared before the existence of the mandate and before the existence of the League of Nations. So wasn't really a conception of a mandate at the time. The rationale for the British was to try to get Jewish support for their effort in World War I, particularly aimed at Russia, which had just overthrown the Tsar. And they had a kind of, the British establishment had a kind of anti-Semitic view that the Jews were very powerful in Russia, especially among, the left, the socialists and the communists. And so they thought by issuing a declaration of, that was positive toward the Zionist movement, that would influence the Jews in Russia who would help keep Russia in the war against Germany. And that sort of didn't work out.
I mean, I think that was part of it. I think the other part was that there were a lot of wealthy Jews in the British sphere, especially the Rothschilds, but there were others, and they would look more favorably on Britain from a funding perspective if Britain came out as pro-Zionist.
Well, that could be. I mean, the person who was directly involved with Balfour was Chaim Weizmann, the head of the Zionist movement, and Tom Segev in his book One Palestine Complete is very graphic on how he talks about the relationship between the two and how Weizmann influenced Balfour to issue his declaration.
Yeah. So I guess that's the outreach to the minorities. All right, so in 1936, we have Sheikh Izzuddin Qassam, and Qassam was a millenarian Islamic preacher. He argued that the injustices against the Arabs of the Mandate Palestine were too many, and the people needed to rise up. And so he put together the different militias and began to work together to try and overthrow the British. This in 1936 was the bulk of the revolt, but it continued for 2 more years into 38 and 37, 38, 39. In this revolt, you had a number of the future Arab leaders come into relief. You had Fawzi al-Qawqji. You can see his picture. He, of course, as you can see by his clean-shaven appearance and Western military uniform, was from the Arab elite that was more European educated and oriented. You can see Abdul Qadir al-Husseini, who was a cousin of Haj Amin al-Husseini and one of the leaders of the Holy Jihad Army. You can also see that the British relied both on their own forces and on members of the Haganah. So you had what were called the Notrim. You can see a picture of the Notrim in the center. These were Jewish members of the Haganah, and they were conscripted as military police by the British in putting down this Arab revolt. And this becomes the first sort of general war that the Jews are fighting against the Arabs, as opposed to these small battles and skirmishes like we saw at Tel Hai. The result of the Arab revolt is that Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was a ideological supporter of the Arab revolts, was expelled from Palestine. He went to Iraq in this period. And the British decide that if they want to avoid future Arab revolts, that they will cut down Jewish immigration. So we have the creation of the White Paper of 1939, which prohibits increased Jewish settlement. In the meantime, during this conflict, the British are stirred to try and find a resolution. And so we have the first division of the territory, let's say, in an attempt to resolve the conflict. A Jewish state is proposed, an Arab state is proposed, and a British corridor to Jerusalem is also proposed for the holy migrants to come to Jerusalem. The Jews tentatively accept the plan. The Arabs reject it. and so the plan is not implemented. At this point, and because of the Jewish involvement on the British side in repressing the Palestine Revolt of 1936, the Arabs refused to meet with the Haganah when it came to hearing out this plan. And so you can see in the upper right-hand side, Arab elites with the British. The elites are from the Arab Higher Committee, meeting with the British over the Peel Commission plan, and rejecting outright the possibility of dividing the territory between themselves and the Jews. In the lower right-hand side, you can see Jews marching in solidarity with the possibility of having a state, not necessarily the specific terms of the Peel Commission.
Richard, the revolt of 1936, you said it was called a jihad.
Yes.
So can
no, sorry. I didn't say that it was called a jihad. It was definitely called as a jihad. Sheikh Izzuddin Qassam was a religious preacher, and he considered this a jihad. But the military that was organized by Abu Qadr al-Husseini, you can see on the lower right-hand side, those Palestinian militants came from a militia that was called Jaysh al-Jihad al-Muqaddas, which in English translates to the Holy Jihad Army.
So jihad just means holy war, right?
Yes. I mean, it means other things too, but in this case, yes, it means holy war. Yeah, you have to one of the interesting things in sort of the history of the Palestinian people is that there is a consistent disagreement among Palestinians about how they should go about achieving their quest for a state. There are those who believe that there should be a secular state informed by Arab socialist or Arab nationalist politics, and there are those who believe that they should try to achieve a state through Islamism, right? This theocratic manifestation of Islam as a governing principle. And Izzuddin Qassam is clearly on the latter group. He is an Islamist in his orientation. What he's trying to do is to create an Islamic country. And it's no accident that the rockets that Hamas uses are named in tribute to him, right? They're called Qassam rockets, right? Because Hamas is also on this side of trying to create a theocratic Islamic governance as a way of liberating Palestine, in their view, right? On the flip side, you have organizations like Fatah, led by Yasser Arafat, which, while they engage in suicide bombing and other aspects that show that they are religiously minded to a degree, their perspective on how the state should be governed is through a secular Arab socialist apparatus. So, so this military gets its name from, ironically, from the Islamist side, even though most of its leaders, like Abdul Qadr al-Husseini, were much more secular in their outlook of how governance should be performed. All right, any further questions? All right, so World War II comes around, and we begin to see that the Zionist militias are faced with a very sort of existential question. The question is basically, what should we do about this war that's going on? Because the British, of course, are the domestic enemy. They're preventing the independence of the state of Israel. But at the same time, the Nazis are clearly the existential enemy in that they're trying to persecute and kill off all of the Jewish people. And the Nazis are aligned against the British. So Ben Gurion issues his famous statement. Ben Gurion at this point is one of the leaders of the new Yishuv. He has, although he had served in World War I militarily, at this point he's primarily a political organizer. And he issues his famous statement, we'll fight the we'll fight the British here in Palestine as if there's no war in Germany, and we'll fight the war in Europe as if there's no war in Palestine. Basically making clear that the enemies, that the local front in Palestine will be treated differently than the foreign front in Europe. And so you had a number of commandants from the Haganah that were sent by the new Yishuv to fight in Europe. Probably the most famous is the Hungarian-born Hannah Senesh. She was sent into Nazi-occupied Hungary, but she was caught. She was tortured. She, according to all sources, she did not reveal those who had sent her or any information to the Nazis before they killed her in 1943. In the meantime, the Haganah and the Palmach stepped up its attacks against the British. Probably the most famous thing that they did were train derailments. You can see in this is a derailment from 1946 of a British-run train in the north of Israel near Haifa. On the lower right-hand side, you can see that the Irgun was also involved in attacking the British positions in Palestine, especially after World War II had ended. You can see the King David hotel bombing, which the Irgun perpetrated. It is believed that there are 91 fatalities that resulted from the bombing. Now, the King David Hotel was bombed specifically because it was the British government operations center at that point of time, but it was still a bombing in which numerous civilians died. All right, and so now we move to the Independence War. So, as you can see in the left-hand side map, even after significant immigration throughout the period from 1920 onwards, over the entirety of the mandate, the Jews controlled relatively little area. You can see the areas of the map that are blue; those are owned by Jews. The areas that are in green are those that are owned outright by Arabs, and the areas that are colored in neither way are owned by the British. Based on the way the Ottoman land ownership laws were constructed, most of the land was owned by the government, and people bought their land from the government. Israel continues to use this kind of land allocation system today. Now, because of this, the numbers in population, at around 1947, a census was conducted. It found that there were roughly 600,000 Jews in the territory and 1.2 million non-Jews, mostly Muslim Arabs, but a significant minority of Christians and also a significant minority of Druze. Given that the Arab population was larger and did not believe that the mandate should be divided, when the UN partition plan was given, that would give the Jews 56.5% of the territory, despite being about a third of the total population. The Arabs were thoroughly incensed by the proposal. You can also see that if you look at the graphs below, in the Jewish state, only roughly half. The percentages are a little off in this picture. About 55% of the population in the Jewish state would actually be Jewish, and there would be a significant 45% Arab minority population. But in the Arab state, there were practically no Jews. And you have to remember that Jerusalem would have been a corpus separatum. It would have been administered by an international force and not considered part of the Arab state. The Jews were in favor of this plan. And in fact, while the Arabs boycotted a lot of the UN procedures that would be designed to do fact-finding missions to find out about this, the Zionist groups were more than willing to talk to the UN officials and give them a tour of the territory and what their needs and desires were concerning it. So one major point that Ben-Gurion had made on several occasions is that he wanted the Jews to have access to the Red Sea in order to have trade with the East, especially Iran, imagining Iran to be an ally of Israel in the long term. And so you can see the Israeli state goes towards the south of the country, despite the fact that there is minimal settlement of any kind in the south of the country.
Richard, can you just outline this conflict in relation to when the state was declared by the UN?
The UN didn't declare the state.
Okay, well, how was the state declared, and with Truman and everything?
No, okay. This is a lot of people misunderstand what UNGA Resolution 1812 actually did. So this was a resolution that was passed on the 29th of November 1947, and this resolution gave legal permission to the Mandate of Palestine to become independent as two distinct entities. Now, it was a permission because previously, under the mandatory system, which the UN inherited by dint of being the successor to the League of Nations, only one country could result from one mandate. That was the idea. The mandate was designed to create individual future countries. So what this resolution did is that it permitted the Jewish and Arab contingents independently to declare independence. There were foreseen borders. Those borders were not binding, but because the Arab delegation refused to agree to them. But those borders would give an idea of where those states should, in theory, be. And it would be up to the Jews and Arabs individually to declare the independence of their respective states. The Jews decided to declare independence on the 14th of May, 1948, roughly 6 months after the UN passed UNGA Resolution 1812, and in the middle of the conflict we're going to describe. The Palestinians did not declare their state until 1988, in absentia in Tunisia. And the Palestinians made the argument that they were given the same permission under UNGA Resolution 1812, and that there was never anything explained in that resolution that terminated the date upon which such a declaration could be made. Right? There was no statute of limitations. They could issue this declaration whenever they wanted. They decided to issue it in 1988, and so that is the declaration that is binding. If you look at most Palestinian embassies around the world today, especially in third world countries, they all recognized the founding of Palestine in 1988 because of this declaration. Okay. So on the 30th of November 1947, you start having what's known as the Palestinian Civil War, which is sort of a strange name to term it, considering neither of the fighters in that war considered themselves Palestinians. The Arabs of the territory didn't call themselves Palestinians yet. That would develop in the 50s and 60s. And the Jews called themselves Zionists. But since it took place in the Mandate of Palestine and no independence had formally been declared, the British were still occupying. It's called the Palestinian Civil War. In this war, because the Haganah was significantly better organized than any of the Palestinian militias, including the Jihad al-Muqaddas, the Holy Jihad Army, the Zionists were winning the war more or less. It was not a clear victory, but it was a slow but steady victory. And so David Ben-Gurion decided to bring in his advisors in May of 1948 to decide whether or not they thought it was a good idea to declare the state. And the reason that it was contentious is that if Israel declared independence as an independent state, then they could be sure that the Arab armies would invade and try to prevent the creation of this state. As long as Israel did not declare independence, there was the thinking that the Arab states would not invade, considering it a local internal Palestinian problem that they could theoretically ignore. But the timeline was moving forward because the British were withdrawing most of their soldiers, and by early May 1948, there were no British soldiers left in Palestine. So either Ben-Gurion was going to declare the state or not, and so on 14th of May 1948, he decided to declare the state. And on the 15th of May, the Arab armies invaded. You can see those invasions on the right side map, and you can see sort of in the blue shading the territory that the Haganah controlled at that point.
So it was literally the next day.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things we're going to have to realize is that the war sort of occurred in several areas. Probably the most important area for the Zionists to control, given its holy value, was Jerusalem. Now, as you can see from the map in the upper right-hand side, the topographic distinctions in the Mandate of Palestine were such that the coastal areas were relatively low-lying and easily communicable. These were also the areas with the largest Zionist settlement during the mandatory period. Jerusalem, as you can see, is up in the Judean highlands, and it's much more of a defensible location. In fact, you can see from this map where the borders of the West Bank are relative to Israel, and you can see that the borders actually follow the fall of the hillside, because the hillside was a difficult border to pierce. Now, given the large Jewish population in Jerusalem, the key element in the War of 1948 was controlling the corridor between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And this is where the majority of the war fatalities and the military organization was based on resolving. So you can see on the lower left-hand side, one of the Haganah food convoys on the Tel Aviv-Jerusalem highway. This highway, as you can see, is in a lower part that follows the river valley between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, which meant that Arab positions in the high mountains surrounding it could pick off these convoys. A number of these trucks were destroyed by the Arabs in the hillside, and required constant Haganah vigilance in order to keep the area of Jerusalem supported. With the intervention of the other Arab states after the declaration of the State of Israel, the Jordanians bolstered the forces in Jerusalem and along the mountain sides throughout late 1948 and early 1949. With British commanders, because of the Hashemite British alliance, including a British senior general named Glubb, the Jordanians were probably the best equipped and best organized of any of the Arab fighters in the war. And they were able to repeatedly attack Israeli convoy positions and destroy those convoy positions. You can also see in the lower right-hand side a picture from the Jordanian War Memorial in Amman. These are Jordanian troops defending, in their view, the old city from Zionist advance. The old city was a particularly contentious part of the war because there were old Jewish communities in the old city from the old Yishuv, as well as new Yishuv Jewish communities in the old city and in the slowly developing Western Jerusalem, which was the new city of Jerusalem. Additionally, the Zionists began to do outreach into the mountain areas in order to try and have Arab support for the Jewish state and protect those convoys. Probably the most famous example is the city of Abu Ghosh. You can see in the central picture, you can see Israeli representatives of the Palmach meeting with the Arab residents of Abu Ghosh and getting them to agree to allow the Palmach to use that city as a base of operations, as well as for them to align with Israel and not attack the food convoys. Regardless of Zionist attempts to control the old city, the Jordanians were able to expel them from the old city, and the old city remained firmly in Jordanian control at the time of the armistice. However, because of Israeli attempts to control the road to Jerusalem, a corridor from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem remained part of the territory under Israeli control at the time of the armistice. And that's why Western Jerusalem remained in Israeli control when the armistice was signed. Any questions, comments? Okay. During the war, one of Ben-Gurion's main aims was to consolidate the various defense forces. We've mentioned that there are 4 major militias that were operating. Of course, the Haganah being the largest single one, the Palmach being those specialist commandos, the Irgun being more of a terrorist group, and Lachi, an assassination group. Ben-Gurion wanted to create a unified command structure and create the Israeli Defense Forces. So he turned to an American general, David Marcus, often called Mickey. And Mickey had served in World War II. He was part of the American Army, grew up in Queens. And he was brought in by Ben-Gurion specifically because he was believed to have no allegiance to any of the particular Jewish militias, and therefore could be seen as neutral by all of them. Haganah and Palmach readily turned to him and allowed him to be the effective commander of all of their forces and disposition throughout Israel. The Irgun was more reticent to join Central Command, and they tried to continue to operate independently. You can see the ship Altalena in the central picture. The Altalena was a ship full of weapons. One of the difficulties Israel had during this war was getting access to weapons. In fact, in the early days of the war, they could only get Soviet weapons by way of Czechoslovakia. That was the way that they had acquired these weapons. But the Irgun had smuggling operations in Europe to get these weapons out. Mickey and his subordinates argued that as part of the new Israeli force, these weapons should be handed over to the Israeli government and then redistributed. The Irgun disagreed and tried to bring the ship into port in Ashkelon, which is a southern Israeli port city on the Mediterranean, and give it to their own people. Angered that the IDF wouldn't listen, Mickey ordered Israeli gun batteries from the Haganah to fire on the Altalena. So this was friendly fire, intentional friendly fire on the Altalena, and you can see the Altalena offshore with the billowing smoke because it's been hit. After this, the Irgun decided to join with the other elements of the Israeli armed forces. The last group, the Lachi, refused to ever join with the Israeli armed forces and so was forcibly disbanded after the assassination of Polk Bernadotte in 1949. Bernadotte was there to try and supervise the creation and implementation of the ceasefire of 1949.
A couple quick things about him is that there's actually a famous movie in the 60s that was made with Kirk Douglas, The Cast of a Giant Shadow. So actually a pretty good movie that tells sort of his story. But also maybe you can add a little bit to this, or I don't know if you're going to cover this later, is that the U.S. and Israel, or the new state known as Israel, were not allies initially. That Israel was basically a Soviet, you could say proxy almost. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you want to cover any of that, or if you have a plan later.
Yeah, no, I have a slide for that. Okay, but cool. No, it's very important, as Aaron points out, that the United States was very sort of wary about Israel as an independent state because they saw it as on the road to communism. They had this socialist kibbutz structure. They had good relations with the Soviets. They were receiving weapons from them. So it was not well received. Unfortunately for Mickey, he didn't survive the war. He was a victim of friendly fire. We talked about how a number of Israeli soldiers went to Arab villages along the Tel Aviv-Jerusalem highway in order to try and recruit Arabs to the Zionist cause. And one of these cases, Mickey didn't use the watchword when approaching the Israeli camp, and he was shot.
And one other
yeah, go ahead.
Thing to sort of remember about him, he's sort of a legend in the Ranger community. So he started the Ranger School in Hawaii after Pearl Harbor, and built basically the Pacific. Back then, there was basically the Atlantic Ranger School was in Fort Benning, and ultimately down in Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. And he built the one in Hawaii. So that, which was focused completely on infiltration tactics, which was both a Marine and Army joint school. So he had, a significant period of time in World War II to sort of develop, what you would call sort of asymmetrical warfare capabilities. So he really was a very sort of influential person. He was a West Point classmate of General Max Taylor, who was the commander of the 101st Airborne. So he was really tied into sort of American military leadership. He was part of the Nuremberg prosecution trials. I mean, he's sort of maybe a lost figure in a lot of these things in history, but he's a pretty amazing person, actually.
Is he
Yeah.
buried in Israel or in Arlington or what?
I think he's buried in Queens.
Oh,
So, yeah, he is. I mean, he was always a U.S. Army guy, right? So part of what he wanted to do, he was pretty blunt about it, was he wanted to bring, kind of that professionalism to the Israeli forces, who were still very much in that, Palestinian mandate era, sort of small wars kind of mode. And he wanted to, build a modern force, because he understood that he understood what the threat was ultimately, is that they were going to be attacked. As he used to say, we're going to be the world's smallest Poland. That was one of his famous lines, is basically attacked from every direction. So we need to be ready for that. So he was pretty accurate about that.
I think it was very interesting that Truman endorsed Israeli independence against the advice of his State Department, and the Defense Department, the military people in the U.S. thought that Israel was going to be destroyed in the war with the Arabs. They basically thought that the Arab side was going to be stronger, and it was help from the Soviet bloc, especially arms that came through Czechoslovakia, that really made it possible for the Israelis to survive and prevail in the war.
Yep. No, so, oh, but by the way, he's buried at West Point, actually.
oh,
There we go.
Okay.
So, just to know. And then, and his wife, so Ben Gurion would write to his wife, Emma, in Brooklyn, and just on like a regular, kind of like one of those old world weird sort of correspondences that people would have that they don't have today, which maybe something missing.
Yeah,
But-
maybe there's a book in that.
Yeah, exactly.
Rich, I have two questions. First question is, if it's okay, I apologize.
No,
The first question is, what was the composition of that 600,000 Jews that lived and defended in 1948, Jerusalem? Composition, what I mean is, how much of the Aliyah was made from, former concentration camp, people that were in concentration camps that they came to defend Israel, or the people that came from Sephardic areas of, Iran, Iraq, and Asia Minor, or whatever else.
okay. When I say that the population was 600,000, I mean the population was 600,000. That includes babies, senior citizens, that's everybody. There are 600,000 Jews according to the census. Now, in terms of who was in Israel's armed forces, we're talking about a few tens of thousands. Of that, the vast majority were individuals who had been in the mandate for at least 10 years. Because these were individuals who were affiliated with the Haganah, or they were affiliated with the Palmach. And those were the two bigger branches. Irgun and Lechi were much smaller number, and we're talking about a few hundreds in those organizations. Maybe Irgun is 1,000 people. In the Haganah, that's where you're going to see a lot of the new people who join, because they came over after because originally when people tried to go to Israel after fleeing occupied Europe, the British kept them out and imprisoned them in Cyprus. Those who, when Israel became independent in May of 1948, then those boats could come to Israel because the British weren't going to stop them. And a lot of them were given guns and told, the front is that way. But even still, we're talking about maybe 5-10% of the people who were fighting were not, the lock, stock, and barrel who'd been part of the Haganah for years. And the immigration from the Arab countries didn't really pick up until 1950. You had trickles, and for example, the Yemeni were a huge contingent in the first Aliyah back in 1905, and so there were Yemeni members of the Haganah and the Palmach, but those were old members. They weren't recent immigrants who were members. We see a lot more contribution from the Mizrahi community in the Suez Crisis in 1956 and the Six-Day War in 1967, but not really so much in this war.
All right, cool. And I mean, one question is, when there was a British mandate, and I would recall, and maybe you can stop me, but Arabs and Jews were working together to get rid of the British mandate. And initially, obviously, British thought of, us Jews as the terrorist organization because of the hotel explosion by, I think it was Yitzhak Rabin was involved in setting up the bomb in a hotel in, I think it was Tel Aviv, I don't remember. And British declared Haganah as a terrorist organization at the time.
Yes, the British declared Haganah as a terrorist organization. The Jews and the Arabs fought in parallel for independence, but they weren't fighting together for mutual independence. It just happened that both of them were rebelling at the same time. The Arab rebellion was much more like localized combat, whereas the Haganah and Palmach did these sort of big theatrical events like blowing up train lines, and the Irgun did terrorist activities by a modern definition, activities where you attack civilians or attack victims, attack in ways that are likely to produce civilian casualties.
And the thing we have to realize is the size of the force really evolved over the 39 different engagements. So it started off really pretty small, and then there was, the forced conscription of 18 to 25-year-olds, which was about 21,000 people, men and women. And then by the end of the war, it had the IDF at that point was 12 brigades and a couple of armored regiments, roughly 100,000 by the end. But they had a big advantage in that the lack of a coordinated theater plan by all the different Arab states, allowed the Israelis to sort of in between each engagement get more organized. And so there was this almost in a weird way, almost like medieval battle, where you'd have a fight and then everyone would go home and then you get organized again and have another fight. I mean, it was kind of a very strange sort of cycle over those 2-3 years.
So Zachar, I wanted to respond to something you said. Rabin was never involved in terrorism. You're talking about the Irgun attack on the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, not in Tel Aviv. It was definitely Irgun. It was not Rabin who was Haganah, who was Palmach actually. The British, in frustration at a certain point, did come down against the Haganah. I mean, they were fighting the Stern Gang and the Irgun because both were actively attacking the British. The Haganah were not attacking them, but they were illegally trying to get refugees into Palestine, by ship. So they came into conflict, but the Haganah was not engaged in shooting battles with the British, except maybe in one case where they combined with the Irgun to spring some prisoners from the British prison at Atlit in the north of Israel. I don't know I hope I was clear. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I want to build on a point that Aaron was making, which is very important. And it's that despite the fact that Israel was being invaded by 5 different Arab countries and 2 auxiliary detachments, one from Yemen, one from Saudi Arabia, these militaries were not working in conjunction, nor were they working well with the 2 Palestinian militias that were formed, that Jaysh al-Jihad al-Muqaddas, the Holy Jihad Army, and Jaysh al-Arabi al-Inqadh, the Arab Revival Army. So, you had Israel sort of expanding and fighting a different enemy on each side. So, as we mentioned, on the Jerusalem front, they were primarily confronting the Jordanians, but as they moved to the south, they were primarily, and to the west, they were primarily confronting the Egyptians. You can see the Israelis, their biggest success was to push forward to Eilat, and you can see them raising the flag in what would become Eilat. It wasn't a major city at that point. They also pushed close to Gaza. Now, Gaza was heavily fortified by the Egyptians, and so the Israelis didn't take it. But they did push further into the Sinai Peninsula. Then Ben Gurion made the decision that he was going to stick to the mandatory borders. He wasn't going to try and take territory from the other Arab nations. And so he pulled back to the borders of the Sinai, and an armistice was signed with the Egyptians in early 1949, in February of 1949. There are comical stories of how the armistice negotiations took place because the Egyptians absolutely refused to recognize the Zionists on the far side of the table. We already saw this, for example, right, with the Peel Commission negotiations in 1939, that the Arabs would refuse to sit with the Jews. The Egyptians were sitting with the Israelis, and the negotiator was famous African-American Ralph Bunche. It got to the point where one of the Israelis sneezed, and the Egyptian said, "God bless you." So Ralph Bunche said, "Well, that's the start of a conversation." They were basically able to come to terms of a ceasefire line with the Egyptians retaining control of Gaza, but the Egyptian forces withdrawing from the rest of Israeli territory. With those forces freed up, Israel began a massive northward push. Their primary opponents were Fawzi al-Qawqji's Jaysh al-Arabi al-Inqadh, the revival army, and Fawzi al-Qawqji was supported very strongly by the Syrians, but he did not have a good organizational structure within his own militia. And so the Zionists were able to push through the northern part incredibly quickly. You can see in the central picture, this is an attack on a Falah village of Sa'sa. Sa'sa is in the middle of the Galilee. Like many Galilean villages, it was depopulated when the Zionists took it over. Whether it was depopulated by the Zionists or in fear of what the Israelis would do once they had control is unclear. But they fled up into Syria. Fawzi al-Qawqji retreated to Syria. His entire militia was overthrown and destroyed. The Lebanese and Syrian forces were also pushed clear out of the Palestinian territory by the Israeli forces. And the Jordanians, sort of seeing the writing on the wall, signed an armistice in April of 1949. The Iraqis, who were fighting alongside the Jordanians, did not sign the armistice, but withdrew their soldiers back to Iraqi territory. And the Syrians and the Lebanese signed onto the armistice, which effectively ended the war, with Israel now occupying 78% of the territory of the former Mandate of Palestine. So, as a result of this war, 720,000 Palestinians fled the nascent state of Israel. There are huge debates as to what the cause of this flight was, and it's really a mix of factors. There was the fear of what the Zionists would do to the nascent population. There were Arabs who said that the Palestinians should leave the combat situation and come back later when the situation had resolved itself. There are a variety of different situations. There were some villages that where there were hostile Zionist military actions. There were others where the Zionists immediately told the conquered people that they wanted them to stay, they didn't want them to leave. So there's a wide variety of conflicting evidence concerning the villages overall, and any particular village. There is a lot of debate, but what is not debated is that between 400 and 500 villages or small towns were more or less erased of their inhabitants, be it intentionally or unintentionally.
And there's,
Richard, a question. Were there any overseers, any foreign people there, or the UN? Did they have anything? Well,
I mean,
where were all the other? What?
that's why Folk Bernadotte was there, right? You remember I mentioned that you have Folk Bernadotte. He was assassinated by the Lehi in September of 1949. His role was to see what was going on with the Palestinian crisis. You also have to realize that UNRWA was convened as a direct result of the Palestinians fleeing to these Arab countries, and the Arab countries not wanting anything to do with them.
yeah. I mean, you can make a very, I think a modern parallel are in Kosovo with the Serbs in Kosovo and the KLA and the evolution of sort of Kosovo as a non-state state in the last 25 years, where you had a massive depopulation of Kosovarian Serbs, and basically, you know, most of Serbia didn't want them for political reasons too, which is they didn't want them to leave. They wanted that frontline kind of proxy there. And then you have, you know, that radicalization that happened on both sides. So, I mean, I've always sort of viewed, I mean, it's much smaller than what happened in Israel, but I view it as sort of an example that in the modern world you can sort of associate that I think makes it a lot easier to understand.
Those, yeah, I think that's right.
And you've had UN and NATO, you've had all the modern institutions, and they really couldn't change it, right? So, you know, the idea that there was going to be some magic overseer that was going to change those physics is probably not very realistic.
What I was asking if there was people on the ground. I mean, there were any delegations or anything, some kind of check.
Yeah, but that's my point, is that there was not going to be a check that would have mattered unless you had another large force that could have come in there as the check.
You have to realize the concept of peacekeeping forces had not yet come into existence.
Exactly.
I mean, there's a whole reason why UNRWA exists, which is that it was founded in 1949, and the Convention on Refugees didn't start until 1951. So the Palestinians are under their own refugee mandate, as opposed to any other refugee anywhere in the world, because the UN didn't have the infrastructure to deal with this kind of issue. They didn't know what to do.
Yeah.
Maybe on a separate question, the first time that peacekeeping was implemented in its force was the Korean War, right? If you think of it, or maybe not, I'm not sure. Right? That's when, you know, kind of like, you know, the Australians and all that other stuff, the UN got involved in the 39.
Right, but that was a UN military force. I don't know if that was a peacekeeping force.
Yeah.
I think the earliest peacekeeping force was UNEF, but I would default to Aaron on that.
Yeah. So no. So the first one, yeah, it was UNEF during the Suez, which was 56. So, you know, which that basically stayed in place until, I mean, recently it sort of turned into sort of a scam because there was nothing between Israel and Egypt except, you know, people trading things. Guys would get an assignment there, and it was like cake. They would just go either live in in Cairo or live in Tel Aviv. So, you know, because no one sees Israel and Egypt fighting each other anytime soon. So, but for those, you know, periods of time, that was it. I mean, so this idea that there was going to be, based on our morality today, some type of fix, I think that's something we have to really challenge. Not because morally it doesn't make us feel good or bad. It just means like the physics of the situation weren't going to be changed any other way. I mean, the United States didn't control Israel, and obviously the Soviet Union didn't. You know, the Soviet Union didn't have a problem with this until they could gain an advantage in the Middle East by having Arab allies, and they made that choice. You know, what, 5 years, whatever, 3 years later, basically.
Yeah, in 53.
Yeah.
All right, so yeah, you can see in the, as I said, in the right-hand map, those red dots are towns and villages that the Israeli government decided to eliminate. Between the years of 1948 and 1952, the Israeli government created a naturalization campaign where on the one side you had the national law, God, the name of the law escapes me, but it was the law of return. You had the law of return, which allowed Jews from any country in the world to become immediate citizens of Israel. But on the flip side, you had the 1952 law of nationality, which meant that any Arab who had previously lived in the territory prior to 1948, but was no longer in the territory between the years of 1948 and 1952, with the exception of small leaves of absence, only the could not gain Israeli citizenship. Only those Arabs that had stayed could do so. And the Arabs who did remain in Israel usually lived in Arab majority cities. And these cities were under a different form of governance than the rest of Israel. Now, Israel was a democracy at that point in time, and all of the cities of Israel, including the Arab cities, could vote for their own representatives in the government. However, the local municipal authorities were different in Arab cities versus the wider part of Israel. And the Arab cities were under martial law from 1948 until 1966. Sorry, should say 48 there. One of the Arab members in the first Knesset, right, because Israel's parliament is called the Knesset, and like any parliament, it's delineated by numbers every time you have an election. So the first Knesset did have some Arab members. This is Saifuddin Zulbi. He represented Nazareth. He was Muslim, but he represented Nazareth, which is the largest, which was the largest Arab majority city in Israel at that time. The largest Arab majority Muslim city at that time was Fahm, a little bit towards the south along the border with the West Bank. But and Saifuddin Zulbi, Ralph can correct me, I believe he was part of the Mapai coalition. Another individual that I wanted to highlight was Tawfiq Ziad. Tawfiq Ziad was known for his poetry and his revolutionary spirit. He's widely seen as one of the early Palestinian citizens of Israel to reject wholesale an Israeli identity and to move forward with some kind of Palestinian autonomy. He never used violence, although he used violent imagery in his poems, such as that we would be the sharp piece of glass in the throat of the Jews. You cannot get rid of us, you cannot shave us away. He was imprisoned in the 1950s and tortured by Israeli authorities, but he eventually was released. He died in the 60s, I believe, in a car accident. So that was sort of where Arabs were for the first sort of 20 years of Israel's existence. At the same time, as Zach pointed out, you had a large influx of population into Israel from the Arab countries. You had a massive ethnic cleansing on the Arab side of Jews as a result of how the political situation in Israel looked to them. Now, of course, there is very minimal evidence, no evidence in most cases, there's some evidence in a small number of cases, of a Mizrahi connection to any of the Zionist militias or to the Israeli military. But regardless, these Jews were expurgated. And of the roughly 800,000 to 1 million Jews who fled from the Arab countries between the years of 1950 and 1957, about 500,000 of them came to Israel. The other 300,000+ of them moved primarily to France, the United States, Canada, and Britain. And for example, this map doesn't show Turkey, but Turkey lost almost all of its Jewish population in the same period.
Richard, when did you start to see refugee camps?
You're talking about the Ma'aburot, like you see on the top side picture.
Yeah.
Yeah, those camps start developing in the Negev Desert, primarily in the area just to the south of Beersheba, in the year 1950. These camps were massive because you have to remember, right? Israel has a population of 600,000 Jews. Post-independence, right? There's probably about 120,000 Arabs left in the population, 100 to 120,000. So Israel has a total population now of 700,000 people, and they're receiving an immigration over the course of 5 years of 500,000 people. It was a massive shock to the system of what it was effectively a third world country that had just fought independence. And the camps were a necessary means of accommodating this large increase in population before all the housing could be built for them. Now, one of the major other issues that was existing at this time was that there was a very strong sense of paternalism among the Ashkenazi elite in Israel towards this incoming population. And since they had not received formal European education in many instances, they were seen as being less able to integrate fully into the Israeli system. And this sort of systemic discrimination against Mizrahi Jews continued until the 1980s. It has waned since then, but there are still markers of it in modern Israeli society, even as most Israelis want to move beyond it.
And when did you see refugee camps for Arabs?
Well, the refugee camps for the Jews were developed as part of Israeli domestic policy. Right, this was the Israeli government. They had passed the law of return of 1950, and so all these Jews coming in from the Arab world were entitled to Jewish citizenship, and they did receive it. And so they were not refugees from the moment that they received Israeli citizenship, because now they are citizens of another country, and so they were housed by the Israeli government in these camps. Depending on when the buildings were constructed, people would be in the camps from as few as 1 year to as many as 7 years. Right. But this was a national process. So these people were no longer refugees when they came to Israel and got their Israeli passports. On the Palestinian side, the Arab countries that absorbed the Palestinian refugees, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, refused to give them citizenship. And so they were put by the United Nations. The United Nations created UNRWA, which gave these individuals the perpetual status of refugees, a heritable status that their children could inherit, and they would be in these camps run by the United Nations. And those camps still exist today, which is why they're still considered refugees, because they do not have the ability to be nationalized in the states to which they are born. It is also worth noting that jus soli citizenship, the citizenship based on being born in a certain country, in a physical territory, doesn't apply to almost any of the states in the Middle East. Right? The only way you become a citizen is from jus sanguinis, the bloodline. And in many cases, still further, only the bloodline of the father. In the case of Palestinian refugees, this has created a really awkward problem where if you're in a country like Jordan, where citizenship is inherited through the male line, female Palestinians will marry male Jordanians in order to secure that their children will be Jordanian citizens. And male Palestinians can't find anybody who will marry them, specifically because there's no prospect for having working papers in Jordan under those conditions.
And one other thing about the Mizrahi Jews in the 50s, they represented at usually about 20% of the IDF, but had a very high desertion rate. And there was a very famous study by, he was then Major Aronson, who became General Aronson, to Major General Leskov, who and there were a few Americans that were basically American Jews that had joined the IDF at that point, who compared the treatment in a very similar fashion to American African American treatment in the military, this sort of 2-3 tier kind of existence, and it was sort of acknowledged that they called them the Oriental Jews, is what they called them. And it was acknowledged that the German and the Central European Jews were basically superior Jews. I mean, it says that in the notes, which is really weird to read given who wrote it and where they're from, but it just speaks to that type of mindset that people still had.
Yeah. No, and I wanted to put that picture in the upper right-hand side to sort of combat this notion. Those are Jews from Tunisia, living in Tunisia. They were wealthy, or relatively wealthy, aristocratic, educated, and the Israeli perception was simply just not that. The Israeli perception was that these were sort of a lower rung. All right. Now, as we mentioned, in the period from 1948 until 1966, the majority of the Arab cities were under a military occupation, and this was not only from the point of keeping the Arab population within Israel from becoming violent towards Israelis, but also to prevent a lot of the cross-border skirmishes that were occurring. One of the things is that almost all of these Arab majority cities were along the borders that Israel had with Jordan or with Egypt. So what you had were the Fedayeen. So what ended up happening is that because they couldn't defeat Israel in war, especially Egypt, but a number of the other states, began to pay money to Fidai, or Arab mercenaries, you could call them, who would cross the border and attack Israeli guard posts, near to the border towns and cities. You can see an area near Galim. Near Galim was a border town in the Galilee region, and you can see dead bodies of Fidei on the ground. There were many of these cross-border raids that occurred, and Israeli police officers routinely and military police had to go take them down. For sort of an image of what these Fedayeen look like, I have in the upper right-hand side a picture of the People's Front for the Liberation of Palestine in Jordan. Although this picture is a decade later than the events that we're talking about, the dress style and sort of organization is no different than there were during this period. And they would go on these cross-border raids and come back into the town. On the left-hand side, we see what happens when the raid goes sideways, which is that you had the Arab city of Kafr Qasim, and there was the military police were informed that there were Arab forces raiding. There weren't, but the curfew was given in the town to prevent anybody from being caught up in the anti-raid actions of the Israeli soldiers guarding the city. But many people had been tending their flocks of goats or sheep outside of the city walls and were unable to get the notice, and so they returned after the curfew and they were shot. So over 50 Muslim inhabitants of the city, 58 inhabitants of the city were shot. Muslims tend to record it as 59 because one of the people who was killed was a pregnant mother and her child died with her. And you can see in Israel today, this is a marker to the shuhada, the martyrs, who died because of this miscommunication on the Israeli side to the the Palestinian citizens of Israel under their purview.
Richard, the context here was that this was on the eve of Israel's Sinai campaign, and they were imposing a curfew on Arab towns.
Yep.
And basically the curfew, I think, was supposed to start at 5 p.m. And in the meantime, you had all these people out in the fields who had not heard about the curfew order. And so they came in after 5 p.m. and these soldiers or border police shot them down. I mean, it was an incredible lapse, really a lapse in, I guess they thought they were justified, but there was no moral justification for what they did.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, if you look at sort of how Yugoslavia, disintegrated, I think it gives us a very strong template on those behaviors. Once you have in and out groups, just what people do to out groups, regardless of, rationale or justification, all their sense of moral compass just, goes off the rails. And, I think that you had a pretty clear period of time that happened, over those 2-3 years. And it really longer than that, actually. I mean, it was, but I mean, at an intensive level over, 3 years.
That's true. In addition to the raids by these Fedayeen, during the period between 1951 and 1956, you had attacks from within the territory of the neighboring states. Most commonly, or especially reported on from the Israeli side, is that the Syrians used their territorial advantage in the Golan Heights to rain rockets down on Israeli settlements close to the Sea of Galilee. Sorry. As Aaron mentioned, in the original period, Israel was in the Soviet sphere and remained there until 1953. At that point, Israel changed its foreign benefactor to France and began to import Mirage 3 aircraft, as well as concluding military alliances with them and nuclear alliances with them. It's believed that Israel and France worked together on researching into the atomic bomb and creating one in Dimona, which is in the Negev Desert in Israel. As you can see on this map, Israel during this 1950s period created what they called the Alliance of the Periphery, where they went after non-Arab states at the edge of the Middle East, specifically Turkey and Iran, to create sort of a pincer group around the Arab states that were opposed to Israel's existence.
Yeah, and this is the French alliance is a big deal because of access to military, financial, industrial support throughout the 50s, and we can't underestimate a big piece of this was the post-war time, sort of say Vichy cleansing that de Gaulle went on pretty aggressively, and the guilt associated with that, the Vichy occupation, and then all the huge volume of migration to France. There was, I don't remember the right number, it was something on the order of 250,000 Jews, or 200,000, I think, maybe, that ended up in France. So that was a big chunk were in Paris. So you had a very strong sort of interest group that formed around supporting the nation Israel, especially militarily.
No, absolutely. And also, as you mentioned earlier, the American support at this time was practically nothing. The Americans were not really interested in this part of the Middle East. And yeah.
I mean, the big thing that the U.S. wanted to do is we wanted to accelerate the decolonialization program in that region. That was basically, and we were itching for situations, which ultimately was Suez, to sort of prove that point, where we were going to throw the French or the English or both of them under the bus.
I think the breakdown with the Soviet Union had a lot to do with Soviet behavior.
Yeah.
First of all, they had mischaracterized what Israel was going to be. Israel was not going to be a communist proxy state. I mean, Israel was going to be an independent country, and I think one thing that got the Soviets thinking was that Israel voted in the United Nations for to support the Korean police action in Korea.
And they voted against the PRC. That was really a big deal.
And then the Soviets calculated that maybe the Arabs were more important as allies. They were more of value as allies because they had oil, and there were so many more countries there and so much larger population that it made strategic sense for them to support the Arab side, and in particular that started with a military and economic relationship with Nasser in Egypt.
Yeah, I mean, I will say this. The end of Stalin was central to this, right? So, Stalin was the last of the OGs, right? I mean, he represented sort of that old view of, Marxist, Leninist, Trotsky, like this
Bolshevik.
ideological architecture.
I totally disagree.
Hold on, let me finish. Can I make a point real quick?
I totally disagree.
Okay, but can I finish what I was going to say or no?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. So the fact that once Khrushchev, and not just Khrushchev, but that whole new generation came in, I mean, there was a massive purging, and you could argue that the Soviets kicked into a much more modern balance of power, strategic frame that they had versus what they had under Stalin. So under Stalin, they would take, let's just say, more bets that I think were more personality driven than under the new Soviet Politburo post Stalin, and so the evolution into supporting the Arab states sort of made sense in that evolved set of Soviets in the 50s.
Rick, can you please mute your line? Rick, sorry.
Now, Marika, tell me where I'm wrong, please.
Well, this is for another time.
That's okay.
No, I don't think Marx is, I mean, Marx was dead when there was the revolution, and Stalin was called the revolution, Marxist revolution, but I don't think he was a Marxist, but anyway.
No, yeah, I don't mean was he actually a Marxist, but that his frame of evaluating people was from that old world, which was much more personality driven. Whereas I believe once you cleaned out basically the Stalinists from the Soviet government in '53, you had a new Soviet at that point, which was much more Cold War footing, much more calculating strategically.
Oh, I think Stalin was very much calculating. I think the fact that that you had an arch anti-Semite like Stalin supporting Israel at the beginning was entirely a strategic calculation to kick out the British. And then in the early 1950s, they saw that this it was no longer a value to them. It was a different environment, and also what they had expected from Israel, they weren't going to get. So it made perfect sense. Now, and the switch started when Stalin was still alive. It did not start with Khrushchev and the bunch of the post-Stalin.
Yeah, but it accelerated into a full, military partnership and strategic partnerships across the Middle East that you didn't have prior to that. You had much more, let's just say, political entrepreneurialism.
Well, Stalin died in '53, so he didn't live long enough to really establish much of a military alliance with the Arab side. But when they started, they arrested a left-wing Israeli representative in Czechoslovakia in 1951 or 52. It was quite shocking to the left-wing Israeli party, the Mapam party, which was a radical socialist party that considered itself pro-Soviet. It was not communist, but it considered itself pro-Soviet. That their guy was put on trial or arrested as some sort of spy, and that was an indication that things were changing.
Yeah, if I may, I don't think there was a big reevaluation of the policy when foreign policy by Soviet Union when Stalin died. It was more internal struggle within the Soviet Union, but it was just general miscalculation by Stalin and others who were there that Israel will be a Soviet Union satellite. And that was very fortunate for Israel. Otherwise, Soviet Union would never vote in UN for creation of Israel. So it was a very, I believe, beneficial mistake by Stalin or by Soviet Union, very favorable to Israel, basically guaranteeing its creation. But then when they realized it's not going to happen, then their orientation changed. And I agree that, yeah, it started changing during the Stalin years. That's my 2 cents on this.
I agree with your 2 cents.
Thank you, everybody. I think we'll probably move on with our presentation. Go ahead, Rich.
All right. So, as we were pointing out, in the Arab socialist world, you began to see the unification, at least in ideology, that Nasser was beginning to create, and sort of this hostile environment for Israel. You have the attempts to unify Egypt and Syria later under one authority. And while this cartoon is about how Arab leaders are accepting Israel, and therefore it's a very recent cartoon, where of course on the Jews' hand is the blood of the Palestinians. This view of sort of this Jewish caricature of representing Israel was highly popularized during the Arab socialist movement, as the enemy against whom the Arabs have to fight, and the colonizer against whom the Arabs have to liberate themselves from. At the same time, in Israel domestically, we have the Druze making the first overt pledge to the Israeli government of any of the minorities within Israel that they would be in a blood pact with the Jews. The Druze are, and the Circassians also, asked that their men be conscripted the same way that Israeli Jewish men are conscripted into the Israeli military. In Israel, both Jewish men and Jewish women are conscripted. The Druze and the Circassians only conscript the men. Other groups like the Bedouin or Falah, if they fight on behalf of Israel, do so by choice. They enlist. And you can see in the upper left-hand corner, this is a memorial service for Druze who have died in the Israeli armed forces. I think between 300 and 400 Druze casualties have died over the course of Israel's wars. And this is in the village of Isfiya, which is a Druze village close to Haifa. On the right-hand side, we can see a Druze commander talking to other individuals in the village about his service in the IDF.
Druze are Christian?
No, Druze are post-Islamic. They're their own religion.
Oh.
All right, so in 1956, you have the Suez Crisis, and you have the Suez Crisis, and this really starts from as an Arab socialist trying to fight against colonization, Nasser decides to nationalize the Suez Canal. Previously, this was controlled by the British government as part of their consignment under international treaty. And during the time that they had it, there were still problems with Israel getting shipping through the Suez Canal because of Egyptian leadership trying to prevent that. But the British generally allowed it through. Once the Egyptians nationalized it, they prevented Israeli shipping from going through the Suez Canal, and they also tried to block the Straits of Tiran, which is the small strait that connects the Gulf of Aqaba with the Red Sea. So Israel was afraid that there would be a large-scale invasion or attack across the Sinai, or that Egypt would attempt to starve Israel out. At the same time, the British and the French wanted to bring the Suez Canal back into British control. And so the British and the French began negotiations with Israel in terms of how to invade Egypt and restore the canal to the former colonial controllers. So Israel began to invade as early as late October, on the 29th of October in 1956. And you can see with the red lines the movements towards the Suez Canal and the conquest of Sinai. At the same time, a few days later, in early November, the British and French naval forces and air forces were to disembark at the Suez Canal and take it. And from a military perspective, the Israelis were very successful. However, from a diplomatic perspective, the United States moved quickly to restore the canal to Egyptian control and force the British and French to leave, as well as the Israelis to retreat back to the 1949 borders. And in its wake, the UN Expeditionary Force was placed. That was the first UN peacekeeping force, as we discussed, along the Suez Canal and in Sinai in general, to prevent Egyptian-Israeli aggression. You can see there Yugoslavs, who of course were part of the non-aligned movement, and so were acceptable to both Egyptians and Israelis to be in this territory, keeping it relatively separate. In terms of military successes, there were very few actual battles in the expanse across the Sinai Peninsula. There were a few. You can see the dots on the map are generally where engagements took place, but by and large, the Israelis were only defeated by American diplomacy.
So Americans defended Egypt's nationalization of the
Yes.
canal?
Yes,
Yeah.
Dwight Eisenhower defended Egypt's nationalization of the canal, and but as Aaron pointed out, the main motive for the United States activity here was to remind the French and the British that they were no longer imperial powers, that the decolonization project would continue, that the nationalization of the canal in Egypt was part of that, and that it would not be acceptable for Israel to expand its political influence beyond the area of the former Mandate of Palestine.
And now in the US, I mean, Eisenhower was president then, but was that position adopted among both Democrats and Republicans bilaterally?
The thing
Yeah,
that
I mean, we were in a different world then where there was an old saying that, you know, domestic or politics ended at the shore's end. I mean, we were incredibly unified in the majority of our politics, I would say, until, you know, let's say Vietnam basically is a safe sort of zone. And then you could even there, at least when it came to the Soviets, probably until the late 70s. You know, so I mean, in the 50s, we were incredibly unified then, and the major leaders in both parties, whether Vandenberg or whether, you know, we had this class of leaders of in both parties that shared or were the minority heads of the Foreign Relations Committee or the Armed Services Committee, and there was, you know, a very, very tight, unified perspective on most of these, and especially Suez, right? I mean, I think, and actually it started before Suez technically, right? Especially with the French, it started in Indochina when we threw them under the bus in Dien Bien Phu. So, I mean, we let them, you know, we basically allowed a French corps to get annihilated. So, you know, it was pretty clear that we weren't doing this for marketing. You know, and so in some ways the British and the French walked themselves into this because they should have read the tea leaves 2 years earlier. I just don't think they actually believed it after World War II. I think they wound up over connecting our commitment to free, you know, to free them as European states from Nazi aggression to supporting them regardless of whatever they did. And I think that's the heart of the mistake that they had to learn, which they did in 56. So
the U.S. support for Israel is more of an outcome of the 67 war.
yeah.
During this period, the United States is incredibly isolationist.
Yeah. And we're focused, really what we are is we're focused on the Soviets and on the Chinese, on, in essence, Soviet, or on global
Communism.
communist expansionism and attempting to contain it, whether it's in Europe or in then the Asia Pacific. That was, you could say 97% of our foreign policy then. If Castro never came up in Cuba, 99% of people would not have known where Cuba probably even was. So it's just, it only became relevant to Americans because of the Cold War fight, basically. As an example.
Yeah. All right, so the 6-Day War, of course, is the war that everybody remembers. And this is where Israel's borders fundamentally changed. You can see after 6 days where the ceasefire lines were. Israel took 6 distinct territories over which they had not previously exercised long-term control. The Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the Old City of Jerusalem, the Unified Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights, along with some small areas of the former Mandate of Palestine that Syria had under its control. And from a diplomatic perspective, it was assumed by Western states that Israel would be able to reach out to the Arab states after this victory and create the conditions for peace. Israel did not reach out to the Arab states, but to be fair, the Arab states were not really in any position where they were willing to make an honest faith negotiation with Israel. And we see in September of that year, the Khartoum resolution, which says that they would not have peace with Israel, they would not recognize Israel, they would not negotiate with Israel. Their view was that Israel had to be defeated militarily. Now, to actually go through the war started with an Israeli preemptive strike. Israel was once again facing an Egypt that was blockading the Straits of Tiran. And given that Israel and Iran were such strong trade partners at this time, with Israel receiving most of its oil from Iran, a blockade of the Straits of Tiran would effectively limit their military capability if they did not strike early. So they did. And they went to the Egyptian airfields and bombed the Egyptian Air Force on the tarmac on the 5th of June, 1967. In this act, they removed 2/3 of the Egyptian Air Force from the map and guaranteed air supremacy throughout the entire conflict because none of the other Arab states had a strong functioning air force. Israeli commandos had also charted during the Sinai campaign the majority of the sand dunes and passages through the Sinai Peninsula. There were many areas where the sand would just be too fine for the tanks to move through effectively, and therefore these would be effectively dead ends. But you can't see them from the air or from the land. You have to sort of be familiar with how the ground was. And the Israelis had a better sense of that geography because they had held on to the Sinai from late 1956 until early 1957 when the Americans asked them to withdraw. And they had performed these maps. So they actually knew the Sinai better than the Egyptians and were able to chase many of the Egyptian tanks into these sort of, it's not exactly quicksand, but areas where they would be less able to effectively move out of the way. So because of this, Arab generals, Egyptian generals in their army began to second guess the Egyptian offensive and ordered a retreat. And as Egyptian commanders from that time will tell you, there was no possible way to be more disorganized in this retreat than they were. And so the Israelis, with their air superiority, began to napalm significant sections of the Egyptian tank corps, and you can see a napalmed tank in the right side picture. The Israelis destroyed a significant part of the Egyptian tank corps, and to this day, many Egyptian tank commanders argue that had they been given the chance to actually fight the Israelis, given that they had a 3-to-1 advantage in terms of the number of tanks, and it was on their home territory, that they may have actually been successful. But because of bad leadership decisions, the Egyptian tank corps was defeated quite soundly within 2
I mean,
days.
I would take issue with that, primarily because the Israelis had adopted combined arms as their approach, which means you combine your artillery, your tanks, your mechanized infantry, and your air force, and any rocket and communications all into one assaultive, force structure and approach. And the Egyptians still had basically a legacy construction of their military. They were basically much closer to the French in going into World War II, in terms of holding defensive positions, very fixed positions. Probably more Egyptians lived because of the chaotic retreat that they took than if they stood and engaged. Because they would have just been fixed targets and, would have probably been annihilated, basically.
Interesting.
I mean, the big thing to realize is that the Israelis read the shift in battle doctrine into applying targeted close air support. And once the Israelis understood they had that advantage, they could take out any Soviet supported anti-air batteries and air defense, then that was it. I mean, at that point, you had complete command in the air, and that was kind of the whole show at that point.
Yeah.
And that's basically been Israeli doctrine the last 55 years at this point.
Yeah, no, Israel really depends on air supremacy.
Yeah.
Then on June 7th, on June 6th, Nasser communicated to King Hussein of Jordan, that he was winning, despite the fact that he was sorely losing, in an attempt to get Jordan to attack Western Tel Aviv, which was Western Jerusalem, which was Israel's capital. Israel sent communiques to the Jordanians to ask them to desist, and saying that they wouldn't attack, even though the Jordanians had already fired salvos, arguing that those were solidarity salvos to show that Jordan was in solidarity with the Egyptians, but they wouldn't attack. As the Jordanians stepped up their attack, the Israelis decided to take the war to the Jordanians. The first major attack was a paratrooping into Jerusalem to capture the old city. You can see the famous picture of the 3 IDF paratroopers in front of the Western Wall. During the Jordanian occupation, Jews were not allowed to visit the old city, and so these were the first Jews to see the Western Wall in nearly 20 years. After they had paratrooped into the old city, they took the remainder of the old city and pushed forward with the tank corps, and then they reached the Jordan River. The Jordan River, from a military perspective, is an incredibly difficult bridge, is a terribly difficult valley to bridge with armored tank divisions because of how steep the walls of the river valley are. And so the only way really to cross with mechanized divisions across the Jordan River is to use bridges. So the Israeli military bombed all the bridges. You can see on the right-hand side, after the war, or rather during the Israeli invasion, a number of Palestinians who lived in the West Bank tried to cross into eastern Jordan, and you can see them crossing on the bridge that the Israelis have destroyed. While it still can carry humans, there's no way that it would be able to support the weight of a tank. And so Israelis effectively prevented the Jordanians from counterattacking after the first Israeli lightning attack. And then, of course, in the last 2 days of the war, the Israelis mobilized against the Syrians, who were also still fighting them. As we mentioned during earlier, the Syrians rocketed numerous positions in northern Israel from the Golan Heights, and so the Israelis considered it a strategic objective to take the Golan. They brought their tanks into position, and one of the key advantages that they had is that they had Eli Cohen, who was an Israeli spy in the Syrian ranks for nearly 10 years. And Eli Cohen had transmitted numerous key details about the Syrian armed forces, their battlements, and their placement to Israeli commanders who used that information during the Six-Day War. Probably the most hilarious story, and there's questions about whether it is true or not, but it's widely accepted, is that he told Hafiz al-Assad, no, it wasn't Hafiz al-Assad, he told the current leader of Syria that what he should do is, he should sympathize with his suffering Syrian soldiers under the hot sun and plant eucalyptus trees to give them shade while they maintain their battlements. And of course, that meant that now from the sky, Israel could see where all the Syrian battlements were by the presence of these eucalyptus trees. And so they could be taken out. And their being hidden was given away. Israeli tanks poured over the Golan and defeated the Syrian positions there and began to press towards Damascus when the ceasefire was called. You can see Eli Cohen in the upper right-hand side. So any questions about the Six-Day War before we move on?
Richard?
Yeah.
One question or maybe statement. On the right-hand side, the tanks, I believe that's Israeli Merkava, but this looks like a pretty modern design. It's not something which exists.
Yes, this is not a picture from 1967. These are modern Israeli tanks taking the same paths through the Golan to get to the border positions with Syria. The reason I chose it is because when the Syrians controlled the Golan Heights, they put numerous mines in the position. And so while there are paths in the Golan Heights that are possible for military vehicles to tread, it is not the majority of the Golan Heights. So there are exact boundaries and roads that military vehicles take. And so these tanks are effectively driving over the same way that Israeli tanks drove over nearly 50 years ago prior to this picture.
Yeah, and the
thanks.
Yeah, the IDF we're still using British AMX and Centurion tanks from World War II and from the end of the Korean War. So that was the majority of their and US Shermans, M50, 51s. So those were the majority of the tanks that the Israelis had.
All right.
What happened to Eli Cohen?
Oh, Eli Cohen was killed in 1965. He was discovered by the Syrians for being a traitor, and he was hung.
Yeah, there's a really good Netflix series on him. With Sacha Baron Cohen plays him, and he's fantastic doing it. I mean,
Sacha Baron Cohen plays him seriously.
No, absolutely, yeah.
He's actually an actor.
Oh, he's a phenomenal actor. Actually, he's a really good actor. He studied on the English theater stage. So while he was doing Ali G, he was actually studying British acting.
Aaron, not when he's disparaging the region next to me, okay?
Look, it's called comedy for a reason. Right? If it was called serious, then you would be going to serious concerts or serious shows. Yeah. And
he's saying, all this disparaging thing about Kazakhstan.
I know. Right?
What's the name of that? What's the name of the Eddie Coin series?
Is it called? Was it Spy? I think it's just called Spy.
Oh. Yeah,
it came out last year.
Oh.
Either last year or at the end of 19. It's all a merge, but I think I want to say it's early 2020 it came out. And extremely good. I mean, it's really good. It's well acted. It's phenomenally acted. It's got a ton of fantastic actors, Israeli and Arab actors that are in it, and yeah, it's a really good. It's a really
Zach, on Kazakhstan, you know, they initially complain about the Barat, but then they realize it's a huge promotion of Kazakhstan, and they changed their position 180 degrees.
Mikhail, the latest one that he did, he's blaming Kazakhstan for COVID-19 spread.
I missed this one.
You can't really be happy about that.
I know, but it's comedy, guys. I mean, it's
Yes.
you know, that's the whole point. I mean, you know, did we take Richard Pryor seriously? I mean, you know, why do we want to take him seriously?
Oh,
when it comes to
For
that.
every Arab that's intelligent, there's unintelligent people sometimes, you know.
So then what are we supposed to do? Ban them?
No.
Yeah.
If you go to Astana right now, you'll probably be more impressed than it's like another New York. It's really impressive.
I'm sure it is.
Capital.
I'm sorry. Astana is I love Almaty. Almaty is the real city. Astana, it looks like a Dubai. That's what it looks like. It looks like somebody's like, ooh, let's build another skyscraper where nobody lives. That's basically what it looks like. Okay. Anyway, War of Attrition. After the Israelis won in the 6-day war, the Arab parties were not willing to accept this loss, especially the Egyptians, considering that the Israelis controlled the east bank of the Suez Canal. The Egyptians reached out to the Soviets, and for the first time, the Soviets actually put soldiers on the ground in Egypt, as well as S-125 anti-aircraft missiles and other war technology. The war was incredibly slow, and the point of the conflict was to just tire the Israelis into retreating. It didn't work. The Israelis held the line. There are a couple major Israeli losses during the war, such as the sinking of the Israeli Navy ship Eilat. You can see the picture in the center. But overall, the Israelis were relatively successful in that they did not give up any territory, and instead built up a defensive trench system alongside the east bank of the canal called the Bar-Lev line, from which they could defend their position on the canal.
Was it actually over in 6 days?
The 6-day war started on the 5th of June and ended on the 10th of June. But the War of Attrition was 3 years. The fundamental distinction is that the 6-day war was a large international conflict where Israel expanded and gained territory. The War of Attrition was shooting one guy like a day, or two guys a day.
Was Suez Canal operating during this War of Attrition?
Yes, it was. Obviously at limited capacity, though.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one thing that's important to realize is that the Soviets provided the Egyptians with intelligence, and the Syrians, that the Israelis were preparing to launch, or that they were massing 11 brigades on their stepping off points on the borders, but the Egyptian and Syrian high commands just couldn't. They didn't believe it. They just, they were still living in that sort of fantasy that how does a little place like this do this to them?
Yeah. No, there's a famous Egyptian saying, the Israelis prepared for war, the Egyptians prepared for a parade. All right, so on the Jordanian side, there was also a renewed set of Fedayeen actions. Now that you had this increase in Palestinians who had moved into Jordan, they began to establish their own towns and create new waves of Fedayeen. Now, in order to counterattack these, Israel was willing to penetrate the Jordanian border. You can see the map where Israel crosses the border and attacks towns and settlements on the Jordanian side of the border, including the town of Karameh. From a military perspective, the Israelis were capable of demolishing the town and killing most of the Fedayeen in the town. However, they did so with a higher casualty rate than expected, and they fought against the Jordanian army that was protecting Jordanian sovereign territory.
Richard, how come they know which one is a Fedayeen and which is not? I mean, they're attacking a town, right?
Right. Because these are military. Because these are military fortified towns.
Yeah, and in Israel, there are all military fortified towns too. So
No.
no, I
No,
mean they're
like,
not
no,
defense.
it's not. I'm sorry. Let me rephrase it. It is a settlement that is primarily a fortress. If there are civilians, the civilians are directly affiliated with the fortress. It's not. It's not like a normal town that just became one with
Yeah, I
military.
mean, like you can't
So-
survive in these spaces unless you are directly associated to that fort or that fortification or that security um defensive perimeter. That's you want to think of it that way. I mean, you just can't have it, you know, it's not like you can have a suburb in Van Nuys there and people can just you know, it just doesn't really work like that. You know, it would be nice if everyone could, but that's the kumbaya, I think, in the end.
So, the interesting thing about Karameh also is that the Jordanian army intervened on the side of the Fedayeen, the Palestinian militants, and you can see in this picture King Hussein of Jordan examining the battle site and looking over recovered Israeli military hardware that the Israelis had to leave behind because of how they retreated from the scene. So you also see that that in Jordan there was a commemorative stamp issued, and King Hussein was famous for saying in those days, "We are all Fedayeen," meaning that Jordan would support the Palestinian struggle. Never mind that 2 years later you would have the events of Black September, where the Palestinians in Jordan tried to stage a revolution against him and his kingdom, in which case he had to put down the Palestinians. It's unclear how many people died in Black September. We don't have really good reporting. The Jordanian government alleges the number to be 300 dead Palestinians. The Palestinians typically allege something closer to 20,000. The Palestinian estimate is probably closer to reality, but the thing is, we don't really know.
Yeah, one other thing that a lot of people don't realize is the scale of Soviet involvement. So at its peak, there was 50,000 Soviet regular army in Egypt. So some people have started it within, you know, the historiography of viewing it as an Israeli-Soviet war in '67. You know, as a proxy, or you know, as a limited, you know, a limited low intensity conflict in the Cold War, or in essence, one of the largest ones that the Soviets engaged in. There's a really good book on it. I put it into the chat.
Aaron, I have a question for you, if you don't mind. No, do you know of this, or maybe this is something that not, you know, maybe it was a hush hush, but apparently Brezhnev personally called the American president and said, if you don't withdraw, if you don't tell Israel to withdraw the troops, we'll bomb the living shit out of Israel with nuclear weapon. Was that something like that?
So there was a hotline that was which was a leftovers of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we communicated on, or basically LBJ and McNamara and Bundy and kind of the whole gang that was still left at that point with the Soviets. The threat was not, well, there was an indirect nuclear threat. The threat was really Soviet conventional bombers. And in essence, the Soviets sort of doubled down on the war in '67, and in essence, as Egypt as sort of their proxy with the Israelis, and they really were sort of driving to an escalation, or at least threatening to drive to an escalation. So, you know, in the end, I think it was ultimately, obviously, a Soviet miscalculation to support it, or support it the way they did. And I think they believed the Egyptians were going to be more effective than they ultimately, turned out to be. So, and one of what's really important is who the Soviets put there. So there's a famous general, Lieutenant General Lashchenko, and he was the commander that put down the East German uprising in '53, and also he commanded 2 brigades against the Hungarian revolt in '56. So the Soviets put significant resources into this. This wasn't just sort of talk, and a few bombers and cargo planes flying in. I mean, you could argue this was probably their largest direct intervention in the Cold War of a non-contiguous proxy state, basically. So Afghanistan's a little different because you could argue there's a contiguousness to it to the Soviet Union, but Egypt didn't have that, and in Vietnam they just had advisors there. I mean, so the numbers were never, it wasn't 50, 100,000 Soviet military and related security forces.
And I guess a couple more military questions. They said during the 6-Day War, Israeli troops were marching, and again, and don't understand me wrong, there's no relation to Nazi troops. They were marching faster than Nazis, and that was some kind of record that they beat.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's. I think the comparison doesn't match because the objectives were different, right? They were not going to, go on a major armored land campaign across the region and take out major cities and hold them, right? So the speed across the desert was relative to their war aim, basically, which was, much more limited, obviously. I mean, there were a handful of Israeli sort of, IDF, sort of, let's say, more extreme I don't even know if they were ultra nationalists. They were just, let's say, more hotheads, who thought they should go on to Cairo and blah, blah, blah. But, no one took them seriously. I mean, they whatever the term in Hebrew is for sort of like whack job, that was their nickname, basically. So no one took them very seriously. So I think the limit was, it was about ejecting and creating a permanent buffer zone around Israel. That was really their limited aims. And to degrade, right? So it was really to create the buffer space, eject all the forces, and massive degrading of all the regional powers once and for all. And I think they did sort of half the job, basically.
Right, and they also used those floating devices that they used during the Moscow defense versus Nazis in Cairo.
Yep.
The Russian troops provided, what are they called, dirigible, or whatever they call them, the floating devices that prevented it. And maybe Mikhail knows more about it. Hot air balloons, yeah.
and one of the things that was really important, and the U.S. really, LBJ and sort of the U.S. national security leadership was constantly trying to calibrate the Israeli response, not to force escalation with the Soviets, right? So the Soviets put regiments around Cairo and around strategic areas that Egypt had forces, and it was made pretty clear that the U.S. that was sort of the line in the sand. was that if the Israelis, attacked and killed Soviet troops, and basically, started a sort of Guns of August feedback loop, that the U.S. was not, that was something the U.S. was not going to sign up for.
Interesting. All right. I appreciate it. And I guess Rich, sorry for the interruption.
No worries.
And thanks, Aaron. I appreciate it.
So by 1973, the Egyptians decided that they wanted to counterattack. And so they did so surprisingly on Yom Kippur, which is the holiest day in the Jewish year, when Jews mostly fast for to beg God for atonement. You can see Operation Badr, that was started by the Egyptians, where they created a functional pontoon boat across the Suez Canal and drove their trucks over it. And they made initial gains on the Bar-Lev line. Prime Minister Golda Meir of Israel was surprised by the Egyptian and Syrian offensive. The Jordanians refused to be part of the war, as they had been in '67. So the war was contained to these two fronts. After a few days, Israeli forces were able to successfully push through the German line. They were able to find a break and conquer the far side of the Suez Canal and trap the Egyptian 8th Army. You can see in the map on the left-hand side how the Israelis held a territory in the southern part, southwest of the Suez Canal, and that's where the Egyptian 8th Army was. But the Egyptians did manage to hold both sides of the Suez Canal other than in that area. Similarly, on the Syrian side, the Syrians did penetrate nearly up to the edge of the Golan Heights, including areas of close to the Sea of Galilee, but Israel was able to push back and actually make it within striking distance of Damascus. From a military perspective, the Arab countries believe that they had at least won to a certain extent, in that they had managed to defeat the veneer of Israeli invincibility in the region by making these early gains and recover some of their lost honor. From the Israeli perspective, even they saw themselves as having been surprised, but yet still able to be victorious. And while Golda Meir suffered electorally for it, the 1973 war was effectively the last war of any Arab coalition against Israel, and Israel's position as a military power in the region was more or less taken as granted.
And one sort of unknown or very limited known fact is that that we were very lucky because between the U.S. Sixth Fleet and the Soviet Mediterranean Squadron, which the U.S. had 48 ships, 2 carriers, Soviets had 52. They sort of encircled each other, like a boa and a crocodile or whatever, and luckily didn't basically start attacking each other, because both sides had brought to the Mediterranean different advantages and disadvantages, and so the Soviets were thinking of needing to strike first because they didn't have the carrier aircraft, and the U.S. thought that that's what the Soviets were going to do, and so both sides were sort of generating this ladder of escalation. This was going on while 73 was happening, so it was the largest confrontation between the Soviet and the U.S. fleet during the whole Cold War. So I put a link in there. It's pretty wild, actually. So
yeah, no, there's also attestations that Golda Meir threatened to use nuclear weapons if the United States didn't help end the war with more military supplies. There's a lot of different ways that this could have escalated to a world war conflict.
Right. And Brezhnev issued a worldwide alert, which then triggered DEFCON 3 for the United States. And so once it's, so this ladder of escalation, the Cold War really kicked into gear. So DEFCON 3 comes with like a, it's like a toolbox. So you had, a U.S. Airborne Division that was on flight ready, to be put in the air. 50 B-52s were recalled to Guam, to the U.S. There's a third carrier task force ordered into the Mediterranean of 2 more carriers. And then the Soviet sent their Alpha squadron, which was 97 vessels, including 23 submarines. So I mean, this thing was really amping up. When you read about it, the link I put in there, it'll just blow you away that this thing didn't go sideways and south.
No, it's pretty wild. At the same time, we have the formulation in parallel of the Palestinian identity. I call it Palestinianism. This idea that the Arabs between the Mediterranean and the Sea of Jordan, the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River have somehow a unique national character, as opposed to being just another group of Levantine Arabs. And a lot of it comes out of the confrontation with the Zionists and with Israel. You can see in the lower left-hand side the All-Palestine government and their passport. The All-Palestine government was an Egyptian proxy state that existed from 1949 until 1959 in the Gaza Strip, before Egypt directly militarily annexed it. You have numerous UNRWA camps throughout the region, where Palestinians saw for themselves they were not Arabs like any other Arab, because they were not treated like the Arabs of the states in which they were living. And oftentimes these refugee camps were overcrowded and underfunded. You can see on the left the camp in Rafah, which is in the Gaza Strip, close to the Egyptian border. Even the Palestinian territories still have these refugee camps, because it's the most effective way to continue to have international support, which is vitally necessary for the maintenance of these populations. And
Which we have one person that raised question. Can
Sure.
Yeah, Rick, go ahead.
No, what's the question?
Oh, he raised the hand. So you
No, I have it. I mean, these numbers are awful. I mean, this is people who doesn't have any rights, and I mean, this is incredible. These numbers are astounding. I mean, this is unreal. I mean, this is horrible. I mean,
Yeah, no. These are obviously the numbers that are more recent, but yes, there are between 4 and 5 million Palestinians in various states of citizenship or refugee status.
yeah, I mean, they are like they don't have any rights. They don't have any. I mean, this is obscene. I mean, I find it horrible.
I agree.
When you said that Israel has about 9 million citizens, that's not including the Palestinians? Or
there are 6 million Jewish citizens of Israel, and there are between 1.8 and 2 million Arab citizens of Israel. There are additionally in the West Bank 2.1 million Palestinian citizens. They're citizens of the state of Palestine. And in Gaza, there are 2.4 million citizens of Palestine. So between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, there are approximately 12 million people, but only 8 million are citizens of Israel.
One other thing, Richard, can you go into, and I think it's something most people don't recognize, is that the PLO's decision-making in the 60s and into the 70s, how they evolved as a, basically a Palestinian socialist nationalist movement, and they basically alienated. They attempted a coup, obviously, in Jordan, but then they were, and then what happened in Lebanon and in Syria. So basically, they they were not, let's say, ethno-nationalist in the traditional sense of the Arab states. And so there was constant friction between them and those states, and that degraded support dramatically throughout the end of the 60s and into the 70s. Can you go into that at all? Because I mean, I think that's
Yeah, sure.
really.
So the Palestinian Liberation Organization as a larger group really comes out of the mid 1950s, but really with the failure of the Fedayeen movement, right? We talked about the Fedayeen who crossed the borders between 1950 and 1956, and by and large they failed. So they decided to organize under political banners, and they created their different liberation fronts, and you had a number of different ones, like the Popular Liberation Front for Palestine and the People's Liberation Front for Palestine, and like they're running jokes about how many different groups there were, and so they were unified under this Palestinian Liberation Organization, headed by Yasser Arafat. And Mikhail, do you mind muting yourself?
I'm
And
muted, sorry.
so they began to try and establish a place where they could have a center of governance. And basically, wherever they went, the Israeli government sent people to expel them. And they finally felt like they found in Jordan in 1968, with the Battle of Karameh, a place where they could be relatively accepted and begin their fight for Palestinian independence. However, with the large Palestinian population that already existed in Jordan and the influx from the Six-Day War, they felt that they had enough people to actually overthrow the monarchy and therefore install a Palestinian state in Jordan anyway and begin the fight against Israel. Their attempt to overthrow the monarchy resulted in their expulsion from Jordan, where they went to southern Lebanon. And you can see here, on the upper left-hand side, we have the results of Black September. You have Palestinians fighting the Jordanian government at Ajloun, which is a Jordanian fortress close to the border with Israel, or close to the border with the West Bank. And the PLO, once expelled from Jordan, went to southern Lebanon. And you can see a Palestinian march in the refugee camps in southern Lebanon. By and large, these were Arab socialist movements. They declared Palestinians, they wanted to create a Palestinian state. Depending on which group we're talking about, some of them were more conservative, some of them were communists, but generally they were not Islamist in orientation. You can also see Yasser Arafat in his younger days as the first and primary leader of the PLO.
Yeah, that's in his Castro Che Guevara look.
Yeah, exactly.
No, but I think it's important to understand that that the PLO made strategic decisions that ultimately isolated them, even amongst Arab states, and then also the Arab states often used and didn't support, meaning allowed to migrate or support the the Palestinians into their own states. And I think that's a piece that is not covered very much. So anyways, but I think
how much of the
we have a lot of different, I mean, we can say, I mean, any country have a lot of wrongs and rights, but these people are, like treated like, I just find it horrible.
No, absolutely. But in Jordan,
I think there is no justification, there is no explanation, there is no way to justify how you can penalize a group of people only because they were born in certain place. I mean, and you're expelled and you don't have a place to go. And legally you're nothing.
Sure,
I mean, what else do you want?
But the Jordanians, as an example, have not given any path to, any path within Jordanian society in the last 50 years because of what happened the first time that they supported, Palestinians in 1970, because you had Black September. So there's this feedback loop. It doesn't mean it's right. I'm just pointing out that that's what's there. And you,
Or the other example is in Lebanon, where you had a very delicate ethnic and religious balance, and if you gave the Palestinian citizenship in Lebanon, then it would then I mean it would do what it ended up doing anyway, which is causing a civil war in Lebanon.
Yep.
So it's not entirely clear that the Arab states could have given the Palestinians rights, but the Palestinians were I agree with you, Marika, that the Palestinians were stuck between an Israel that threw them out and Arab states that wanted to wash their hands of them anyway.
well, and then you had, and I'd say the third side of it was then you had a PLO leadership that was sort of a a revolutionary leadership, right? In that sense of the 1960s meaning of it, and they, you could argue they contributed significantly to the creation of the Lebanese Civil War. They probably are, I don't know if you put a percentage on it, 25-50% of how the thing, really, escalated pretty dramatically. And so you had these three forces, where you didn't have any compromising room there between any of those three. And you could argue today, there's a sort of a fait accompli, really, at a certain level, especially with the Abraham Accords, et cetera. So,
Rich, how true is this that Golda Meir was offering for a lot of Palestinians to stay on and not to leave, and the decision was made to strategically leave to basically kind of show also that here we're suffering and we really need to our own state, stuff like that.
What are we talking about?
So Golda Meir offered for Palestinians to stay during the 96-7 war, 1973 war. There was an offer on the table saying, don't leave, stay with us, be our Israeli citizens. Was there anything to that?
I'm not aware of any offer where the Palestinians were given Israeli citizenship. The offer, what Golda Meir, well, first of all, it wasn't Golda Meir, it would have been Levi Eshkol if it was during the 67 war. But what I remember Eshkol saying was to the Palestinians who were living in the West Bank, you needn't leave. You can stay here under Israeli military authority. The majority of the citizens, the majority of Palestinian refugees and Jordanian citizens who lived on the West Bank didn't take that offer seriously, and they crossed. But there was a significant percentage that remained behind, which is why the West Bank has a population of 2.1 million Arabs. But they didn't become Israeli citizens. Now, when Israel annexed East Jerusalem and in 1980 under the Jerusalem Law, there are different accounts of exactly how they offered the Palestinians living there Israeli citizenship, because you can't, because under Israeli law, they couldn't make that territory Israel while not giving citizenship to the people living on it. But at the same time, it becomes very confusing exactly how to get citizenship. So some of them have it, some of them have residency IDs, some of them don't even have that. In the Golan, it's much more straightforward. Most of the Arabs left the Golan, so it was just Druze, and they were offered Israeli citizenship and they refused because they didn't want to be seen as traitors to Syria if the land should ever go back to Syria. But almost all of them have residency passes.
I see. Thanks a lot for clarification.
and I think one of the things that's, to this day, that's still part of this dynamic, right? Where there's like a vicious cycle between all of the parties that just really can't be broken out of.
Right.
That's the heart of, or that's part of the heart of it, is that there's not the ability to compromise to, whatever the opportunity on the table is, and then incrementally build from there, or there's not enough trust that somebody's willing to agree to whatever deal is agreeable, right? The best deal in front of you. And so there's just a vicious cycle that of 25, let's say, years of mistrust in the negotiations, and then obviously 50 years before that of conflict, or basically.
So
You guys, go ahead, sorry.
I actually wanted to discuss where we want to go in terms of time, because we're basically at the year 1975, which is about halfway through the presentation.
So maybe we should do, you wanna do another?
I imagine other people want to eat dinner too. So I'm sort of curious where people want to go from here.
Yeah, we can move this to, following week. I can move my Nubia one to the following week or something, or we can, skip the week and then we'll go to the next week and move it to that. I can talk to you, Rich, if we can have a part 2.
Okay.
This was great, Richard.
Amazing. That's why we just have so many questions.
Oh, great.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we can't pass through any of the slides without asking a million questions, because this is a problem right now, in the East. And you can think of a lot of the conflicts right now arise from people looking at this conflict as like, well, this is never going to be solved.
Yeah. No, okay. Yeah, Zach, I think the best thing for us to do would be to do it next week, same time. But you and I will be in contact about making that happen. Before, and I think this is actually a really good place to switch, because the Yom Kippur War into this is a fundamental change in Israel's political situation, where it moves from being a question of Israel's existence and fights that are sort of these multinational Arab coalitions to try and destroy Israel, from Israel being a regional power, not the power, but a regional power in a multipolar system, and able to exert its influence over smaller states, and over the Palestinian quasi-state.
Nuclear power too. So
Yeah.
Well, I'm declared, Marika.
It's just like India and Pakistan, right? It's the same thing, basically.
Yeah, but well,
Exactly. We don't know.
the more the less, the more scary.
Well,
Anyway,
if Ukraine would have never gave their nuclear, capabilities to Russia, who knows if the Crimea would have ever happened.
Yeah, but no. So this is something you have to know about this. The Ukrainians never had the launch lock control mechanism codes. Those were always maintained inside the Soviet nuclear command. So the Ukrainians never had independently operational nuclear warheads. And that's something very important to always realize. So I think a lot of people, even within the Ukrainian ecosystem, don't really know that.
Well, I don't know exactly what their military capabilities, but I think Ukraine is a big player in the military market right now.
No, absolutely. But what I'm trying to say is that when people sort of try to connect the dots that, well, if the Ukrainians had their own nuclear weapons, then that would have been a hedge against Russian behavior. That was never going to happen. I mean, that was never going to happen. So when you had the breakup of the Soviet Union into the CIS, into the independent states, the Ukrainians never had that. So when those Soviet army cadres left, they left with those launch mechanisms, the physical mechanisms, and also the launch codes themselves and the launch code mechanisms behind it. So the whole architecture to be able to actually launch.
I would also assume that even if Ukraine would have nuclear weapons in their possession and had the codes and so on, I still can't imagine they would use it when Russia attacks Crimea.
That's right.
It will be a complete suicide.
Yeah, and the other thing too is that the refueling is it's a special mixture, right? And there's a recycling process in this, right? So it isn't like you build a nuclear missile and it sits in a dormant for 40 years and you push a button and it can go, right? It's not a movie. So it's the maintenance behind this. None of that maintenance existed in the Ukraine. And that was all part of the legacy Soviet army, which then became the Russian Missile Command. So all of those special mixtures and all the sites that made those mixtures were all in proper Russia themselves, actually. So
yeah, I mean, at a restricted time, it was all for taking. I remember one of the drug lords in Colombia wanted to buy a nuclear submarine from Russia in the 90s. That was something that you couldn't, and then he was offered, he was told, do you want to buy it with a crew or without a crew?
yeah,
That was 90. So all the things you're saying, Aaron, is correct, but I lived through those times. And
no, there's a Netflix show of a famous Russian Jew KGB guy who wound up he's still alive. He's down in Miami. He's sort of one of the guys that helped build the whole Miami 1990s sort of, the major Russian, migration that happened into Miami, into New York, all the big, mafias and so on. Right. And it's on Netflix. It's pretty wild. This guy his life's absurd. I mean, he's worked, no one knows